Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome to the Global Systems Institute seminar. My name is James Dyke. I'm an Assistant Director of the GSI, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Genevieve Guenther, who is going to be giving this week's talk. Some of you, in fact, I know lots of you do know Genevieve's work because she's been working in the climate science, climate policy, climate comms space landscape for a number of years now. Before you all joined the call, I was talking to Genevieve about how am I going to introduce her, given that she has such an extensive and impressive biography. So we've settled on some pretty good text, I think, that captures some of the stuff that's going to be relevant today. Because obviously Genevieve could be talking about a whole bunch of other things, but today we're going to be talking about essentially the book, The Language of Climate Politics. Fossil Fuel Propaganda and How to Fight It. That was published in the summer of last year. Along the way, Genevieve has also advised NGOs, corporations, policymakers on climate communications and also very specifically climate misinformation or disinformation. Her research has appeared all over the place. It's been in scholarly journals, academic peer review stuff, but also places such as the New Republic, Scientific America, Wired, and she speaks a lot about not just the book, although I know she has been talking a lot about the book, giving lots of book talks, but the role of communications, the requirements for us to get more engaged in policymaking and communications, and also just the value and importance of language itself. So we are absolutely, I almost said the word delighted. I just can't use that word. It's everybody starts a LinkedIn post with, I'm delighted to. So we are thrilled to finally be able to have Genevieve give a talk to the seminar series today. She has very kindly agreed to talk to us at 2 o'clock our time, which is a little bit earlier, given that she is in New York. So we're very grateful about that. The plan is that she will be talking about the book and climate comms for about 45 minutes. As she does so, I invite you all to write questions and comments or observations in the chat screen, which is down there on my screen anyway. And then after 45 minutes, we will have a discussion and I'll bring in some of those questions and comments, and that will round out the hour, I would imagine. So anyway, without further ado, welcome Genevieve. I'm going to give you kind of a virtual clap, if I may.
Thank you so much, James, for that introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk to the GSI seminar series. I am equally thrilled to be here, perhaps even more thrilled. It is an honor, and I must say it is also a delight. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the origin of my book project and give you an overview of its arguments. Maybe delve more deeply into one particular chapter or one particular strand of the argument, and then open it up for questions, and I can take up whatever other topics might be interesting to you all. So I will begin by saying that well, let me just preface this by saying my background is not actually in the hard sciences or even in the social sciences. My background is in the humanities. Specifically, I was a Shakespeare scholar and a scholar of Renaissance literature before I got extremely alarmed about climate change after having a child and started to sense that the way the problem was being represented in the news media and even by climate scientists occasionally was not sort of enacting the principles of effective political rhetoric that I had learned in my scholarship from, thinkers as ancient as Aristotle and Plato. To me, I thought the way the crisis was being communicated was actually counterproductive because, as we know now, people don't necessarily respond to facts. They respond to activation of their political identities, the conjuration of emotions they hadn't had before, and feelings of desire to either have something new or create a new world. This was not worked out at the time, and I wasn't quite sure how I was going to intervene in this space. I took college-level courses in climate science. I read all the communications literature that I could find. but I wasn't quite sure how I was really going to pivot officially. But what happened was in 2017, the New York Times hired a conservative commentator named Bret Stephens. And at the time, Mr. Stephens was an inveterate climate denier. He was someone who said that climate science was a religion presided over by singularly unattractive hierophants, I think was his really nasty phrase. And I was so outraged that what I took to be the voice of sort of liberal America, liberal in both senses, the left-wing sense in the United States, but also sort of just, liberal in terms of the rule of law, the rule of fact, the rule of science, perhaps to market ends, but nonetheless based on so-called Enlightenment principles, thought that climate denial was like legitimate political commentary in 2017. And so I began a campaign to try to get the New York Times to rescind their job offers to Stephens. So I guess I was sort of an early adopter of cancel culture avant la lettre. And in this effort, this activist effort, I got connected with other climate scientists who were also circulating an open letter to the Times. I got connected to climate activists and also to many journalists within and without the climate space. And I got, very interested in Stephens' work. The New York Times did not respond to this external pressure. Stephens took up his position at the paper, and his first column was called Climate of Complete Certainty. And what it was a very sophisticated rendering of the climate disinformation that had dominated basically since about 2009, the Copenhagen Accords and the rise of the Tea Party in the United States, which was that there was some sort of uncertainty in the climate science that meant we couldn't really justify spending a lot of money or even passing robust policy to try to halt global heating because climate scientists weren't really sure whether the problem was even real. So as we know from the work of Naomi Oreskes and others, this was designed to create doubt in the electorate so as to, lower the salience of the problem and create resistance to the communications of scientists. But what I realized from reading Stephens' column, and in part because I have training as a literary scholar, and my training has made me very sensitive to the ambiguities of language, the way that words mean more than one thing at once, and the way they can mean one thing to one social group and quite another to a different social group. So I have that training, but I had also just recently taken a college level course in climate science. And there, in that course, I had learned that in scientific discourse, as you all know, uncertainty does not generally mean the colloquial thing, not really being sure, not having enough information, not being able to make a judgment. What it means essentially is range of possible outcomes. So you can talk about the uncertainty interval of a model, or you can talk about the confidence interval. It essentially designates all the possible outcomes that you can project with confidence. And I realized that what they had done was appropriated this term from the climate science, circulated it in the public sphere using its colloquial meaning. And thus, anytime a climate scientist who was called upon to talk about climate change in the news media or to policymakers scrupulously talked about the uncertainty of their models, they would seem now to be sort of confirming that there was some doubt about whether the phenomenon they were studying was even real. What fossil fuel interests had done was appropriated and weaponized this term from so-called our side, and thereby manipulated climate scientists into inadvertently confirming or amplifying fossil fuel propaganda. And once I recognized this dynamic with the word uncertainty, I started to see it everywhere. And indeed, it's moved into new domains because, of course, climate disinformation has changed. Essentially, since the publication of SR 1.5, the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, commissioned by the UNFCCC at the Paris Agreement COP, it has become, at least until the election of Trump in the United States, it has become very difficult to advance straight up climate denial, not only because policymakers finally sort of realized that this was an immediate problem. We would have to decarbonize our societies by 2050 if we had any chance of halting warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, leaving open the question of whether that was even possible in 2018 or not. But also, of course, the climate crisis is accelerating, and we can see its impacts all around us all the time. So this kind of attempt to create doubt in the reality of the phenomenon faded into the background. And what has emerged since then is the disinformation that I try to dismantle in my book and offer alternative language to combat. And this denial is designed to produce the false belief that we can keep using fossil fuels and still halt global heating anyway, or still deal with climate change in some way. This is the fossil fuel propaganda, the so-called climate denial that dominates now the political discourse, certainly in the United States, arguably in the UK as well, and certainly globally. So what I did was I started tracing all of the words that I thought had this quality of being appropriated from our side and then used to advance this false belief, this fossil fuel propaganda. And eventually, the files that I was throwing things into got very thick around 6 particular words. Alarmist cost growth, quote, India and China, innovation and resilience. And I realized that together, these words weaved together a narrative, which you will hear very often out of the mouths of policymakers, out of the mouths of CEOs and industry leaders, and in the news media. And the narrative goes something like this. Yes, climate change is real, but to say that it will be dangerous or catastrophic is just, quote, alarmist. Anyway, it will, quote, cost too much to decarbonize our economies, and human flourishing relies on the growth, quote, that fossil fuels enable. So we need to extend fossil fuel systems into the developing world and the global south, and then just cope with climate change using, quote, innovation and increasing our resilience. And anyway, the West really shouldn't bother doing anything about climate change while emissions keep rising in, quote, India and China. So this is the core. James is laughing. I know it's really absurd, but it doesn't seem absurd unless you already know. And so hopefully what the book does is expose the absurdity of these claims and then offers you alternative language with which to talk about these problems and their solutions in a way that will lead to the raising of the salience of climate change, but also the true belief that, in fact, we do need to phase out fossil fuels in order to halt global heating, and that phasing out fossil fuels will actually be a good thing for the majority of the world, not a bad thing. So that's what the book is designed to advance. And just to toot my own horn here a little bit, after I finished the book, indeed, after I had already given it to my editor, thank God this turned out that way, I did focus group polling on the messages that I develop in the book. And it was shown that they do raise support for phasing out fossil fuels among concerned and alarmed people on the right and the left by up to 10 points. And so just a parenthesis about this taxonomy of the concerned and the alarmed. This comes from the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication. They've segmented the United States and indeed the world into these 6 groups. The alarmed, the concerned, the curious, the disengaged, all the way down to the dismissive. And in the United States, in fact, the vast majority of people are already concerned or alarmed about climate change, even if they don't put it at the top of their list of immediate concerns. They are concerned and alarmed about climate change, but only a very small number of people in the United States, and perhaps in the UK as well, actually support the phase out of fossil fuels. So in the United States, I think it's 31% of people. And of course, that number is being influenced by partisanship. Only 13% of Republicans support the phase out of fossil fuels, but it's also the case that only 48% of Democrats, a minority of Democrats, support the phase out of fossil fuels, even though over 90% of them support the goal of getting to net zero emissions in the United States by 2050. So there's this like self-contradiction in the political views, even of the left and the center left in the United States around this issue. And so ultimately, the sort of political argument that the book tries to make is that the reason emissions aren't dropping more quickly, the reason that we're kind of stuck on climate change, the reason that climate deniers keep getting elected to important positions like the American presidency is not that climate politics are polarized and our side keeps losing. It's that there's a remarkable amount of unity around this idea that we can keep using fossil fuels and still deal with climate change anyway. I mean, as Malm and Winton said, I think a few months ago or weeks ago, I'm not sure when they spoke to you, part of that complex are these models that allow policymakers to say that 1.5 is still alive because they model overshoot of that temperature target and then the return to 1.5 by the massive deployment of carbon dioxide removal technologies later in the century. And so that I will discuss a little bit too, because that falls under the rubric of innovation in climate change discourse. TLDR, innovation, at least until recently, has been code for carbon dioxide removal. My prediction now is that it's also going to be code for new drilling practices and possibly solar geoengineering. But at least in this political moment, it's code for CDR. So what the book does is takes up one term per chapter and dives into the complex of interests and associations and assumptions and ideological premises that allow this word to be used as fossil fuel propaganda. It tries to dismantle that whole complex and then offer, as I said, alternative language. So I will begin with chapter 1. About this idea that people who talk about the dangers of climate change are alarmists. So, this is rhetoric that has been adopted by most of the cabinet that Trump has appointed. Trump is an inveterate climate denier, but his cabinet talks the talk. Yes, climate change is real, but it's not an immediate crisis, and we're not alarmists. Like all those crazy hippies, they're alarmists. So, and this isn't a very effective charge because it suggests that, either people who talk about the dangers of climate change are emotionally unstable in some way, they are too easily frightened, they're cowards, or that they're in some sense manipulating facts in order to produce certain political outcomes like socialism. So this is a favorite accusation of commentators on Fox News, that the climate change crisis is just exaggerated in order to force socialism down the throats of the American public. So that's the context of this. And what I argue in the book is that this has a remarkable amount of stickiness because there are a significant number of groups and people inside the climate movement, including sometimes climate scientists, who give credence to this argument that people who talk about the dangers of climate change are alarmists. So I sort of lay out this taxonomy to make this argument. And so I talk about the lukewarmers. So these are people who, like the right-wing commentator Ross Douthat at the New York Times, or Holman Jenkins Jr., who's the climate and energy commentator at the Wall Street Journal, they will do this thing where they acknowledge climate change is real, but then claim that, any worry about it is just alarmism. Next to them are what I call techno-optimists, who take climate campaigners and indeed the whole climate movement to task for scaring people. Because these people, I would argue, have the true desire to raise the salience of climate change and to encourage the adoption of solutions. But they are uncritical capitalists. So they believe that the best way to do this is to get people excited about the economic opportunity that decarbonization presents to industry players, and to create a sense of optimism and excitement about solving the climate crisis, and to separate out that project from any association with like stinky hippies. So these people kind of downplay some of the worst projections of the science and try to create this feeling of optimism in order to drive solutions. And very often these people acknowledge that we do need to phase out fossil fuels, or at least significantly reduce the use of them. But they also very often believe that we can deal with a really striking amount of residual emissions by deploying carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering, because fundamentally they have swallowed the capitalist ideology that humanity has the capacity to substitute the work of, or to substitute technology for the work of ecosystems. So these people don't want to countenance the discussion of the dangers of climate change or acknowledge that there might be any limits to our technology or to our sort of, indeed existence on this planet or in the solar system. Very often there are people who booster Mars colonization, et cetera, because this runs counter to their ideology that the market is going to solve this if we create the right conditions. And then, so that sort of gives aid and comfort, I would argue, to our enemy's accusation that we're alarmist. And then next to these techno-optimists, and perhaps between the lukewarmers, you have groups like the Breakthrough Institute in the United States, who argue that indeed we just need to keep expanding fossil fuel use, that this is perfectly coherent and in line with attempting to deal with global heating, because again, global heating is not a catastrophe. It's like a case of planetary diabetes, I think the executive director of the Breakthrough Institute once said. It's something that we need to just sort of manage moving forward. Of course, climate scientists like Joel Gergis, the Australian climate scientist who was one of the lead authors of WG1 in the last IPCC report, AR6, has said that, in fact, climate change is not like diabetes. It's actually like cancer. It's something that emerges and then starts to produce symptoms. And it's something that you need to catch from those symptoms and cure before it spirals out of control, before it metastasizes and spirals out of control. But again, that understanding, scientific understanding of the climate crisis is denigrated as being catastrophist, alarmist, crazy. And now there's this thing in the United States rising called the abundance agenda, the abundance movement, which is essentially the all of the above energy policy that was advanced by Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, the entire center of the Democratic Party, which is essentially, we can do both, and climate change isn't going to be that bad. Then you have the alarmed, not the alarmists, but the alarmed. And these are people like, for example, Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, who once called our current era the era of global boiling. And these are people who understand that the oil and gas and coal industries are not partners in the energy transition, and we cannot rely on future technologies to reverse overshoot, and that we are in a climate emergency, and we need to decarbonize as quickly as humanly possible if we're going to save a habitable planet, a livable future, as much of the economy, as much as of our lands, of our waters, of our airs, of our homes, of our businesses, of our lives as we possibly can. The last group of people in this sort of network that I lay out are the climate scientists. Now, I will say that some climate scientists got really annoyed when Guterres said that the era of global boiling has arrived. They thought this was hyperbolic, embarrassing, inaccurate. One climate scientist took to then called Twitter to say, the oceans will never boil because you need, for some physical reason. And this is so not the point. But they resist hyperbole. They resist metaphor. They resist any kind of communication that appeals to the emotions, that creates images of disaster in your imagination, which rhetoric and literary theory tell us are the kinds of speech that actually change political dispositions. And I get it, and I try to say this in the book, that I get it, because many scientists are just sort of congenitally opposed to ambiguity, to literary language, to exaggeration. They are mathematicians. They believe in empiricism. They believe in objectivity. And this is how their authority in our culture has been structured up until now. I don't know how it's going to be constructed moving forward, just because everything seems to be thrown up into the air. But if your sense of yourself and your position in culture depends on your ability to embody objectivity, of course you're going to resist this kind of language. Furthermore, I think climate scientists have been very afraid of creating feelings of despair and increasing the number of doomers, so-called doomers, who believe that, we're never going to solve this and the world is just going to collapse within the coming decades. What I try to argue in the book is that most doomers don't misunderstand the climate science, or, aren't really nihilists, although we have some of those, certainly among the, white male commentariat, academic commentariat in the United States. But most doomers feel despair because they feel that our political system, democracy, and capitalism are inadequate to solving this problem. And so their feelings of despair arise from their beliefs about democracy and our political system, and not so much about, the way that scientists communicate about the climate crisis. In fact, you could argue that scientists downplaying some of the dangers of the climate crisis could lead to feelings of being gaslit or unheard or disempowered, especially for people who are very concerned about the issue. So, and indeed, I also trace the recent history of climate politics in the US, where some scientists who were concerned about creating doomerism and who also felt that it was important to attack the climate crisis with a sense of optimism, and who also were connected to the Breakthrough Institute, took up the question of what our emissions trajectory really would be through the 20th century. So, as I'm sure many of you know, one of the representative concentration pathways of the IPCC is the 8.5 RCP, which models a concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that would lead to about 4 degrees Celsius of warming, or possibly more. And that the way this RCP was drawn out, it seemed like a scenario that would lead to that much warming by 2100, even though in in fact, as you all likely know, it's a way to model a forcing, right? A concentration of greenhouse gases that leads to a particular forcing. And there is a scenario underneath it, but that's sort of just instrumental to this model that allows climate scientists to think about the impacts of that kind of warming or do other research with that much forcing in the model. But bad actors and some techno-optimists like Michael Liebrich, who is in the UK, argued that this this RCP path, this RCP was implausible because the scenario underlying it got the economics of coal wrong, and it modeled too much coal use later in the century. And they argued that this was creating doomerism, this was creating inaccurate information in the news media, and that this scenario needed, or this pathway needed to be scuttled. And so there was this little burst of research around this pathway, and two climate scientists, Glenn Peters and Zeke Hausfather, published this paper in Nature saying that actually now there has been so much progress since the Paris Agreement that, in fact, we are now on a pathway to like 2.8, 2.9, possibly 3 degrees Celsius. And indeed, the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, has also updated its projections of warming, bringing them from 4 degrees Celsius to around 3 degrees Celsius on our current policy trajectory, or at least the policy trajectory that we were on before Trump's election in the United States. So what happened from this research, however, is that a new narrative deployed by the lukewarmers, by the techno-optimists, and by the climate deniers was born, which was that we have, quote, avoided the worst case scenarios, and that we were on the path of progress. And this got picked up by the news media and disseminated as the promise that what we were doing on climate was working. We were no longer facing a catastrophic future, at least in the rich world, in the United States, the UK, and Europe. And that now climate change was simply an epochal injustice that would be foisted on the poor and the global South. But essentially, we had now avoided the worst case scenario. And this got weaponized. Ross Douthat of the New York Times took climate protesters to task because he said we don't need more climate policy because we've already avoided the worst case scenario. Holman Jenkins Jr. not only pointed to Hausfather and Peters' research, he pointed to the journalist who ironically was most instrumental in disseminating this new media narrative, who was David Wallace Wells, who had written this great alarmed text, The Uninhabitable Earth, but who sort of, took what he heard from scientists at face value and reported it. But what got lost in this whole thing was the fact that Hausfather and Peters said explicitly, as we all know, that 3 degrees of warming by 2100 would be utterly catastrophic. And not just for the developing world, not just for poor people, but for the entire planet. So if we allow the planet to heat up 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, much of the United States is going to be life-threatening to people in the summer times if they work outdoors because it will be so hot. That is not a non-catastrophic future. Furthermore, it seems as if, and certainly there is some debate around this, there is currently a debate on my social media about this very question, but you can make a plausible argument that the impacts of warming, the level of warming that we're seeing has been projected with stunning accuracy by climate models. But you could also make the argument that the impacts of that warming that we're already seeing at 1.3 degrees Celsius are in fact emerging on the worst side of the range of possible outcomes, at least on a regional level, which is not well captured by global climate models. I mean, I have quotations in the book from very sober, very non-alarmist scientists saying that this heat wave, this 2021 heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, was not well captured by climate models to that date, and that this was something that you had not expected to see at 1.2 degrees Celsius. Arguably, we had not expected to see Los Angeles, one of the most affluent neighborhoods in Los Angeles, in addition to a neighborhood which is extremely affluent by any global standard, burning to the ground at 1.3 degrees of warming. So arguably, this idea that we've somehow avoided the worst case scenario and what we've done on climate so far is working is actually a new form of disinformation that is not only getting spread by the deniers, but is also getting amplified, justified by our side in ways that are getting weaponized. Lots of stuff that scientists are saying about this is being left out. Their language is being twisted, but on a high level, the narratives are the same, which is why they become conventional wisdom, and it's just why they support the continuance of business as usual. So what I say at the end of this chapter is, in fact, it is ridiculous to think that we've avoided anything until emissions actually start to bend down at the scale and speed that they need to in order to halt global heating before any tipping points get activated. It is appropriate to be alarmed. In fact, being alarmed is not a symptom of twisting information, and it's certainly not a symptom of hysteria. Rather, it is a testament to your ability to look at the information and not flinch. It is a testament to your bravery. It is a testament to your courage, and it should be talked about as such. Feeling alarm about the climate crisis and not looking away is courageous. And in fact, what we need to do is encourage other people to have that courage and join together to fight against the people who are trying to block the phase out of fossil fuels. We can't spend our days thinking about the impacts of climate change, disasters, what is happening already to our world and the people that we love, what might happen to our children. That kind of fear and grief will be paralyzing. What we can do and what we should do and what we should tell other people to do is recognize that we need to have courage, we need to encourage other people, and we need to band together to put our attention on the people who are blocking the phase out of fossil fuels. And I will just say here, which I realize I didn't say before, that in 2023 in AR6, the IPCC said that we already have more fossil fuels than we can use to halt global heating at 2 degrees Celsius with more than 50% confidence. And that is why we have to phase out fossil fuels. If we are going to use carbon dioxide removal, we would need it for negative emissions and for things like agriculture and medical plastics, and not for the continuance of the fossil fuel system. All right, so that is not quite 45 minutes, but I think I have said quite enough. And I would be happy to talk about the other elements of the book. I delve into climate economics in cost and growth, both Nordhausian economics and cost, but also the resource economics in growth that argue that we can just substitute technology for ecosystems. I discovered in researching the India and China talking point that, in fact, not only has China cornered the market on clean energy technologies and materials, they've also passed an entire policy architecture called the 1+N policies, which basically not only sort of give the vision of how to lead to an ecological civilization in China, peaking emissions in 2030 and zeroing them out by 2060, but also sort of have step-by-step plans and have set up an entire implementation structure and a verification structure in place. Like they're actually doing this. And Donald Trump thinks that he's going to make America great again by trying to go backwards. Yeah, the 20th century, if the West doesn't get off its proverbial behind, is going to be dominated by China. And then in the end, I talk about why resilience should be a much more limited term. It shouldn't be a synonym for adaptation, both for scientific and political reasons. And then at the end of the book, in the epilogue, I try to give sort of tips about how to talk to people about what you've learned in the book, but also climate change in general. And again, like the messages in this book and the messages in the book were developed for people who are already concerned and alarmed about the climate crisis. The task for talking to people who are disengaged or who are curious but aren't really sure is very different, but I do get into that in the epilogue. And yeah, so that's the book. I would be very happy to take questions from you guys now. And again, thank you for having me.
Virtual round of applause your way. That was awesome. Thank you so much. We have some questions in the comment. I think we've already got some, and I'm sure some more are going to come in. But I get first go. So, you mentioned Women Andreas's book Overshoot, which I've got a copy of somewhere. Right. Yeah, this is, yeah. And I can see there's a copy of a book just behind you. I don't have that in my office, I'm afraid, so I can't hold that one up. Right?
There it is.
It was a great book, but I've got mixed feelings about it because I was working on a book proposal, and I was just about to submit it, and then they sent me their review copy, and basically they'd said everything that there was going to be said about this. So okay. And I also had mixed thoughts about your book because I wanted to write something about this, and you kind of come up with something which is like a million times better. So it's like, well, someone's done the job. So there's so much to pick up on. I just want to talk about one thing. Speaking as an academic, as somebody who works in that climate space and has had some of the similar frustrations about, I mean, some people call it tone policing, where you have knowledgeable, eminent people taking great care and time and effort to ensure that the science is not misrepresented in certain ways, so it's not considered to be alarmist. And I completely understand how that has emerged in that particular community. It's a community that's been attacked for decades, sometimes identified, individuals picked upon, language picked apart. We've now got a new administration which is going to weaponize the state to attack individuals as well. But what it has meant is there's been this kind of asymmetry of potential engagement, right? And a good example of that was when you talked about the RCP 8.5, which in some respects is a very technical and obscure kind of argument that had this disproportionate impact. But it was, and I think as your book really successfully identifies it as a great example of just how important the framing the language is, because they were quibbling about a possible future by the end of the century and arguing that now we've got new scenarios which are not as catastrophic. Somehow that represents progress at a time of record-breaking greenhouse gas emissions, right? It's kind of surreal world that we've got. And now we've got 2024 as the first post 1.5 degrees Celsius year. And in 25, now we've got the Trump 2.0, with the administration packed full of climate skeptics and deniers. It becomes even more important for people to step up and really try to effectively engage. So you mentioned that because that's the latter part of the book. Have you got any? Give me something to be optimistic about in the context of, can you see people already beginning to pivot in ways that is becoming more effective, given probably how bad it's going to be, at least in the United States?
I actually am taking a surprising amount of hope from this moment, and I'll tell you why. Because as I said at the beginning, to me, the reason that we are not making more progress on climate, the reason that emissions are not bending down, is that there is remarkable unity around the idea that we can keep using fossil fuels and still halt global heating anyway, or still deal with climate change in some way anyway, whether through technological band-aids or fixes, or just because the problem isn't going to be that bad, or because you can make the global south poorer and this will make them resilient to climate impacts. Whatever the arguments are, it always comes back to we can keep using fossil fuels. And you saw this in the Biden administration, where the US became, the largest producer, and the largest, I guess it was already the largest producer of fossil fuels, but now it's the largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world. While Biden really did kind of dedicate the majority of his presidency to trying to pass climate legislation, right? So, and then in the 2024 election rather, excuse me, you had Harris celebrating fracking, celebrating record fossil fuel production in the United States. You had Tim Walz saying, we can do both. And the vast majority of the Democratic Party believes we can do both. Too many energy modelers who influence the news media and the Democratic Party also believe that we can do both, because they take an entirely technocratic view of the problem, and they model that carbon capture, for example, can actually capture 90% of emissions, because that's what the papers on it promise, and there's no theoretical reason why it couldn't happen. They ignore the history of it not happening yet, and they just argue that's because we haven't figured it out. But because theoretically it can capture 90% of emissions, they're going to put that in their models, which are advising the Democratic Party on how to make energy policy. So to me, that's why we're stuck, because there isn't a powerful constituency in the center, on the left, arguing, no, we actually have to phase out fossil fuels. Fossil fuels weren't even mentioned in the Paris Agreement. So, and then today, New York Times, Ezra Klein, who is basically our most influential commentator in the United States on the left right now, had a kind of Q&A with his editor. And they were talking about how nothing Trump is doing is focusing on prices, which is supposedly why he won the election, because of the inflation in the United States and people being mad about the price of eggs. And he's doing nothing to bring down the price of eggs. And Ezra's editor said, well, he's promising to increase fossil fuel production. That's what I think he thinks is going to take care of the prices. And then Ezra himself said, oh yeah, well, his moves on energy don't interest me. So that phrase really jumped out at me, because he's still, Ezra Klein, in the year of our Lord 2025, is still calling fossil fuels just energy, not fossil energy, not dirty energy, energy. There's still this idea that this is just the energy that modern society needs to power itself. So to go back to your question, to me, I think what is possible in this moment that would not have been possible had Harris won the election, honestly, is for all of us who know to actually introduce the idea or the truth into public discourse that no, actually, we need to phase out fossil fuels in order to halt global heating. And because lots of climate impacts are going to happen under Trump's watch, we can continue to pin fossil fuels on the right, continue to pin climate impacts to the right, to fossil fuels, and try to break up this unity and create distance so that we can actually have the political conflict that we have to this day not actually had, because everyone is aligned around the status quo of fossil energy powering a growth economy. So to me, this is actually a moment where this cultural shift could happen more easily than it it would have happened had Harris won and continued the energy policies of the Biden administration and been championed by people who want to go into government themselves, but are taken as climate authorities by the US news media, and who essentially would be greenwashing the continued system that is causing the destruction of a habitable planet. So that's what I see as being very hopeful, that we can actually get this in there. You know, obviously, as Overshoot argues, the ideas and the language that rises to the top, that is given power, is usually the language that upholds the interests of fossil capital, right?
Mhm.
It's the language that justifies the status quo. And what we're trying to do is show that the status quo is catastrophic, right? So
Mhm.
it's not going to be easy for, you know, especially because the right has captured every social media platform that the climate movement used to organize and amplify our messaging. And we don't have any money. Philanthropy is going in other ways. I mean, it's a very bad scene, but we can use this moment to our advantage, to the benefit of our children and future generations, mark my words.
Okay. Okay. There are a couple of questions that come in. I just want to respond to some of that. The A couple of years ago, I tried to write something about, I think I might have complained to you about this problem that
I
write
remember this
about.
conversation.
I tried to write about net zero and overshoot, and pointing out that Biden, in his first 6 months of his administration, issued more oil and gas leases than Trump did in the previous four, right? And
Right.
fundamentally, neither of these potential future administrations would really tackle the issue of increasing fossil fuel production and fossil fuel consumption. And for that particular publication, that was like a no, right?
Right.
That would give succor and support to the Republicans in the midterms, and basically they just spiked it. That was very frustrating. And it's been extremely frustrating, also concerning, to see there hasn't been any suggestion that that kind of narrative or political approach is going to change. And now with Trump, I think we're at the point where they're probably just going to just outright dispense with even the notion we're going to avoid dangerous climate change. It's straight to adaptation with bits of removal and then geoengineering, along with all the kind of opportunities to, this sort of deploy shock doctrine approaches, where as things get worse, then that just represents new political opportunities to increase polarization, decrease collective efforts to decarbonize. You could see how it could be effectively weaponized. So that makes it, so I completely agree, that makes it even more important, absolutely crucial, that you talk about fossil fuels. It's not about scenarios and net zero. It's about how quickly are you going to stop burning coal, oil, and gas. And if you're not, then what's the point?
And not only fossil fuels, but then connected to the people
Mm-hmm.
who are promoting them and blocking their phase out. So it's not just the object, it's the people who are using this poison, who are using this dangerous thing to enrich themselves, enrich themselves no matter what happens to the kids that we are, helping with our homework at night or whatever. And so, I mean, just to talk about, I don't even think that the Trump administration is going to bother with adaptation. I don't think they care about people enough to even bother with adaptation. And one thing they do after each climate disaster, they did this in the summer, and I wrote something for Prospect in the UK about this. And I thought it was just an election strategy, but then he did it again with the fires in LA. They not only deny that climate change had any role in this disaster, they actually just simply blame the Democrats with lies. They make up falsehoods about what the Democrats did or didn't do, and then blame them for the catastrophe. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that the other thing, I think it's just really, really, really important. Yes, we need to talk about fossil fuels, but we need to start telling stories about people who are doing things that put us in danger, that put our lives in danger. And I know that sounds uncomfortable or somehow not done, or maybe a little I don't know, icky.
Hmm.
But that's the problem, because first of all, they are doing those things. And second of all, that's how they're talking about us.
Hmm.
We didn't ask for this battle. We didn't ask to be born at this historical moment, but here we are. And so let's rise to the occasion.
Okay, that's great. A quick question. Well, I'll just read out from Kai. Thank you for your talk. A question about grief. It sounded like as a communication strategy, you're recommending folks lean away from climate eco grief, more towards alarm and courage. Do you have any thoughts on how we can hold the space for people to productively process this grief that can lead towards more active hope rather than trying to avoid inevitable grief and disassociation?
Yes. I mean, let me say that thank you for your question. It's a really good one. And let me say that there's not one way to talk about this crisis. I mean, ultimately, I think anything we say has to come back to fossil fuels and the people who are trying to keep them in our systems. Bye, Hattie. Thank you for coming. Um, Ultimately, no matter what we say, it has to come back to those two things. But there's not one way to talk about this. And I think it's enormously important for climate communicators to acknowledge grief and to hold space for that grief, so to speak, and to be the safe people that people can come to just discharge their fear, discharge their grief, and know that that means that they're one of the good ones, that they're having these feelings, that these bad feelings are normal and evidence of the goodness of their heart, and that not to have these feelings in this moment doesn't speak well. So it's good, it's okay. I also think, and I mean, this is not scientific at all. This is totally anecdotal, but I'll just say it anyway. In my own parenting, I found that I have much more success, not only in enforcing the rules and holding boundaries, but in sort of getting my kid to take on those rules as his own, if I sort of empathize with how much he hates the rules or the frustration or the grief that comes up around them. Um, and I don't try to just sort of, scold him or shame him into silence or something. And I actually think there's something in that for climate communication as well. I think that it's very important, perhaps, to start with, it's also hard. It's not only hard to see climate change in action, it's also hard to imagine resolving it, especially if you're affluent. Um, Anyone who tells you that there aren't going to be some personal sacrifices like, international jet travel at the drop of a hat multiple times a year is selling you something, is selling you a promise that they really shouldn't be making necessarily. So I think that there is grief, there are difficult emotions. And I think not acknowledging that is part of what creates solution aversion. So if, and you also finally, in order to be trusted as a communicator, you need to be authentic. Trump is a liar, but he's an authentic liar. And if you are feeling grief, if that's where you are, that's what you need to speak from. And so then you will connect with people who are also feeling that way. And maybe that's your role here. Maybe that's the part that you play in this. Each of us have our own calling in this historical moment. And so if you can be the person who connects with people over those difficult feelings, I say thank you for doing that service, and I am actually with you. And it's a real practice for me to allow those feelings in and have them move through me, and then to refocus my attention on the people that fill me with righteous outrage. But it's a regular process. And sometimes I wish I hadn't even started working on climate change. So I am definitely with you.
We are a little past 3 o'clock, but I wonder if we are able to take one more question. I'm going to ask the boss, Harry. Harry, are we able to extend a little bit?
Yeah, we should be good to keep going. Cool.
Okay, so if that's all right, are you okay to do another question, Genevieve? Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. I'm just seeing that Pierre is here and hi. I didn't know that he would be in on this. Nice to see you. I'm happy to stay. I don't have anything else until noon my time, which is in 2 hours from now.
Well, okay. I think I might have, but I'd much rather be here. Let's have a question from Simon, who said he was referring back to Overshoot, and they advocate for, let's say, more radical action. Because for those who don't know, Andreas Malm, one of the co-authors of that, previously wrote How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and so he asks, how do you see this framing interacting with the broader cultural and political narratives around climate change, particularly in communicating need for systemic policy change and phase out?
Wait, I'm so sorry. I didn't follow the beginning of that
Oh,
question. Can you
sorry.
reread?
So, with regards to the book Overshoot,
Yes.
um, okay, he says it challenges traditional narratives around climate activism and advocates for a more radical approach to spark urgent action, which
Yeah.
could involve, I guess, blowing things up,
Mhm.
or other acts of property damage. Where does that, is there a role? I don't know. I don't want to speak for Simon, but is there a role for that? Is it counterproductive? Some people find that very problematic. Um, I mean, what are your thoughts with that with regards to how we should be communicating using language in climate change?
I mean, I think the research shows that having a radical flank of a social movement, people who threaten violence, is actually very effective in driving people towards more mainstream um, organizations working on the same issue. So I think there's some research showing that the existence of the Black Panthers made MLK seem more palatable to Americans than he would have otherwise, for example. Although, of course, that's complicated because, of course, he was extremely unpopular until after he died. So I think that I think it's important to have a radical flank. I think the threat of violence could be salutary in some contexts, but I don't think that radicalism without a big movement is going to do anything. Anything. Like, we have had 2 people in the United States set themselves on fire to try to raise awareness of the climate crisis, and nobody even remembers who they are. So I think that, and lots of people through Scientist Rebellion and XR and, Just Stop Oil are getting arrested right and left just for civil disobedience, not even violence. And it's just like a drop in the bucket. So I think that if the movement grows, then it might be a time to talk about more radical actions. But calling for radicalism without growing the movement first, I think is just it's just not going to lead to the kinds of outcomes that I think we all want. That's what I think. Not yet.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take one more then. And you've said hello to Pierre already, and he did ask a question. It's higher up in the chat. On the issue of people media being too alarmist, where do you see we, as scientists, drawing the line between Guterres saying global boiling, brackets, okay for me, and The Guardian, for example, saying the collapse of the land sink? I can understand that Pierre's going to be quite exercised about global carbon stuff, but yeah, or the Gulf Stream could collapse as early as 25, brackets, not okay for me. So what?
Yeah. I mean,
What could Pierre do?
scientific inaccuracies are never okay. So I think there's a real difference. I think what you're picking up on, why you're okay with one and not the other, Pierre, is that there's a real difference between obvious metaphor, between the expression of emotion around the science, between even drawing out worst case scenarios and highlighting tipping points. Although I understand there's some debate around that, and just getting the science wrong. Like, you can't get it wrong. It has to be right. So I think that's the line. As long as what you're saying is accurate and you're not making mistakes or not, misrepresenting things. I think that with the core of accuracy, then emotional communication, metaphoric, hyperbole, literary storytelling, are all very valuable. So that's the line that I would draw. Has to be accurate, but then as long as it's accurate, you can be hyperbolic about it. I don't know how you feel about that, but that's how I would do it. That's how I try to do it in the book. That's what I do.
I think that's a very reasonable answer. Okay, I think we're going to, yeah, I think we're going to stop here. That's okay.
Of course.
Well, thank you so much again for coming along and talking to us. There will be a recording of this.
Oh, there will. Great.
Yeah, and we didn't mention fossil fuel funding, so I'm sure there won't be any problem us putting it on the internet. So we did, yes, it was a fantastic conversation and great contributions from everybody. So thank you everyone for turning up. Thank you for your comments, for your questions. Thank you again, Genevieve, for your earlier than I would be happy start to your day. Once again, if you haven't read the book, then you definitely need to get a copy. The Language of Climate Politics, available in all good independent bookstores, right? Yeah, don't buy it from
And on bookshop.org.
Yeah. Okay, yes, of course, yes. So all it remains for me to say is thank you once again, and to give you a final virtual round of applause. Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Bye, everybody.